I went to school at Oregon State University in Corvallis, Oregon, and I was a business major. And throughout the business courses, I didn't want to be in sales. I didn't want to be in marketing. I didn't like economics. I had a hard time passing that class, and I knew there was something else out there. But I never heard the term public relations in my entire time at the college. But in my junior year, I decided that I wanted to get some media experience. So I went to the local radio station, a commercial station, and I met the owner and I said, I want to get some experience. I don't need money. You don't need to pay me. And he said, well, I can't do that. I'll put you to work selling spots. So that's what I started. And then within about 2 days, he said, we have a Sunday night opening on programming. Would you like to have a show? And I said, well, you mean on air? And he said, yes. And I said, well, okay, I'll try it. I've never imagined myself being a radio disc jockey. So I started a 4-hour program on Sunday night that was directed to college students, the local community, and an Air Force base that was north of town. And I did a combination of jazz and comedy recordings, which were a big thing at that time, light modern jazz and popular music. But being in that position, I also had an opportunity to interview all of the talent that came to perform at Oregon State. So I met the Limelighters, the Kingston Trio, the Brothers Four, Ray Conniff, Nat King Cole, just on and on and on. I had them all in my program. And that began to give me, a feeling for getting to know these folks, their organization, how important communication was and the questions that I asked and what I was able to get them to reveal. I was in the advanced program of the Air Force ROTC at college. And when I graduated, I was commissioned a second lieutenant, and the first base I requested was Andrews Air Force Base, which is outside of Washington, D.C., and is home to the president's airplane, as you may know. I eventually became the base information officer, and I had a staff of 50, as a second lieutenant. We had a weekly newspaper, 10,000 people living on base, and I did all of the press conferences for President Lyndon Johnson at that time. And Vietnam War was going on, so Secretary of State Dean Rusk, and all of the rest of them. And I got to know the Washington Press Corps, and it worked out well. And they had, I'm sorry I'm making this a long story, but the point is the Defense Department had a graduate course set up at Boston University in communications, and I got to go to that. And it was in the School of Communications, and that's where I really learned about public relations and the agency business. There were Carl Bayer people there lecturing to us. And even though I was in the midst of, the beginning of a career, I made the decision that, holy cow, the agency business sounds really great. I went from there to Japan for 2 years as the base information officer, and had a lot of experience in building community relations with Japanese people because the Russians wanted us out, so did the North Koreans. We were a security base. But it more than ever convinced me that this communications thing was so essential to the mission of any organization. So after 5 years, I got out, and lo and behold, there was an opening with Carl Bayer and Associates in the San Francisco office. The one-man office, Bob Richardson, decided he wanted to go to 2, and I was the second person plus a secretary. And gosh, I couldn't, they didn't pay me much. It was like, well, I won't go into that, but clients included, the CEO of Kodak and getting him an interview. And Carl Bayer launched Sesame Street. In fact, our agency was involved in naming Sesame Street. And I had all the original characters, Big Bird and Mr. Hooper and all the rest of them out and arranging interviews for them in the city. It was just a great experience. And having had that experience, which was mainly about publicity, Carl Bayer was a huge publicity machine. We won more silver anvils every year than anybody else. And it was because of the attention that was generated for our clients. I eventually got an opportunity to become an account executive, and that was with Fireman's Fund Insurance Company. It was out there. And then senior management wanted me to get into more of a management role. So after a number of years, I began managing the Los Angeles office. Then I also managed the San Francisco office after Bob Richardson retired, and got a real good sense for agency management and hiring people, promoting them, measuring them, all that kind of thing in public relations. And in addition, working with some great clients. All that eventually got me to New York. Our agency was acquired by Foot Cone and Belding. And we were, in fact, one of the first major agencies to be acquired by an advertising firm. And Hill and Knowlton was acquired by BBDO, I think that's right. And in 1986, Foot Cone and Belding decided they wanted to sell it to Y&R, and we were merged with Hill and Knowlton. And on that day, Larry Foster, who was the head of communications, longtime head of communications at Johnson & Johnson. I was in New York at that time. I was running the Carl Bayer unit that went into Hill and Knowlton. But Larry Foster called CEO, a guy named Bob Dillenschneider, and said, hey, I've read about the merger. I like it. I have an assignment that I want to give to your agency, but I need a senior executive to be in charge. And Dylan Schneider called me at home that night and he said, we get this great opportunity to go to work for Johnson & Johnson. They usually use Burson Marsteller, but they can't on this case. And I said, Bob, I don't know anything about consumer products I really want to be into agency management. And he said, well, just go out and check it out and see what it's all about. So I did. After a couple of days, met Larry, and it turned out to be the product that became Splenda. It was a compound that they were developing, and they knew that it was a controversial category, and they wanted to have, a public affairs program. And so I put that together, and within a couple of months, I had the biggest account in the shop. That's how I got to know Larry, and I met Jim Burke, the CEO at the time. Jim Burke is the one who managed the company's Tylenol crisis in Chicago in 1982. And I got to know them, and after a couple of years, they started talking to me about possibly joining the company, and I said no 3 times. I love the agency business. I love the variety. And after a period of time, Jim Burke called me and he said, I want you in my office tomorrow. So I went out, and we spent a couple of hours talking, and he was a wonderful person. And at the end of a couple of hours, he asked me, he said, look, if this all sounded right, and we know you're good at this business, and you ought to be doing it someplace where it's important, like healthcare and Johnson & Johnson, would it be possible for you to decide to leave the agency business? And I said, well, I'd like to hear what you have to say. And then he put an offer on the table, and I called my wife and I said, sweetheart, for the sake of our family, I can't not do this. I didn't realize how poor we were. So I joined Johnson & Johnson in 1988, and it was absolutely the best thing that I had done in my life. The credo values, which I can talk about a little bit, but it came together perfectly with my own values, and what I felt about the communications function. And Larry Foster was getting ready to retire. He did a year and a half later, and then I became the chief communications officer. And I worked for 13 years for the next CEO, a man named Ralph Larson, who really understood the importance of this function that we're all about. He granted me unlimited access to the company and unlimited funding. I had the opportunity to commit the corporation whenever I needed. He and I got along famously, and the other good thing about that was that in the time we worked together, we split the stock 4 times. So we really were able to generate a lot of value. But I have to say that for me, that really cemented this idea and the truth that public relations, corporate communications is an essential function in any well-managed organization, whether it's a for-profit or a not-for-profit. And at that time, I also was introduced to the Arthur Page Society with the Page Principles, and all of that just came together for me, you know, with the values of the company, the principles espoused that were attributed to, actually written by Ed Block and Jack Coton, based on the experiences that Arthur Page had, but it just brought everything together for me. And it was a wonderful time at that company, and I had the opportunity to lead almost all organizations. I was chairman of Page, the Arthur Page Society. I became chairman of the seminar. I was the first chairman of the Institute for PR after it separated from PRSA, and met so many people along the way who had great influence over my life and what I was doing. And it just really, again, reinforced this idea of the essential role. And I truly believe that this field is a calling. It is a practice, but I think those of us, and I can point to many people besides myself who have been very successful, really recognize this as a calling, a very important function, particularly in this time when more and more corporations are becoming purpose-driven. And one of the distinguishing factors about who we were, I believe, for a lot of time, was that we practiced with purpose, not just driving sales or, you know, trying to make our companies successful, but we really sought to make them significant against the values and the purposes that they articulated. So, I mean, that's a long story. I apologize for that, but I feel blessed, quite frankly, with the opportunities that I've had and the chance really to make a difference. And so in retirement, I've been on a kind of a mission to try to recruit the next generation of leaders in corporate communications and public affairs, and to acquaint students of management with the importance, the imperative of the communications function in any well-managed organization. I've had a chance to visit a number of colleges and universities across the country. I love meeting with young people who are considering this profession and trying to explain to them, because they get it, that if you really want to make a difference in your life of work, there probably isn't any better place than public relations field, because we are quite unique, driven by purpose. Not that the CEO doesn't or the others, but we are driven by a sense of real purpose. It is driven by the values that we bring in and our commitment to the truth. And I've had a chance to make a difference in organizations that I have been with. And I've been pleased to mentor many, many young people who have gone in and developed, really interesting careers. I have to say that I think this function has never been more important than it is today, given everything that's happened in our society, the divisiveness that we currently see, the fake news problem driven a lot, through the social media. As Richard Edelman said, we're in the midst of an infodemic. And as Alan Murray of Fortune observed recently, in addition to a climate crisis and all the other things, we face a trust crisis. And I think, it's sort of understood by anybody who's been in this profession for a while that change for the better only comes about through effective communication. And we are at the center of that need and that opportunity to really improve, to win back public trust. And that's why it is such an essential function. And we truly need to bring along the best and brightest young people to show them how they can make a difference and the rewards that can come from this profession. I do think the PR industry has changed quite a bit since the time that I was at Carl Bayer and today, and it's still changing. It was a practice when I first started, mainly devoted to publicity, but all of this movement toward, purpose and all of that has made it essential, and public relations agencies have had to follow along and not just be publicists, but to become counselors and to their clients. And as I've told many of them, don't strive just for success for your client, strive for significance for each of your clients. And when you put it that way, it really changes the thinking, not only within agencies, but within corporate communications departments. And then, of course, with the advent of the internet and all of those requirements, many more skills have been developed and added to our practice. So it's not just a practice anymore. It really is an industry, and it is so essential. One of the things that I just briefly mentioned or touched on lightly, the experience at Johnson & Johnson, was to come in contact with our credo, as it's called, or its credo, which was first, it was written by General Johnson, Robert Wood Johnson, who was running the company in the 40s, and he published it in 1943 when he decided that they would take the company public. And we had minutes of the meetings that he had in New York with potential investors, explaining to them that if you're going to buy stock in our company, you need to know how we run it. And this is how we run it. We put customers first and foremost. And that's the first tenet of the credo. The second tenet is to the employees. There's quite an elaboration about what that means, the responsibility that we take. The third is to the communities in which we operate. And the fourth tenet is to stockholders, by saying that if we do the first three of these rights, then stockholders ought to fare pretty well. The unique thing about the credo is that it articulates the responsibilities that the company accepts for who it is and what they do. General Johnson, having developed the company in the United States and abroad, reminded management that the company made very important essential products for health and well-being. and that we needed to remember that not everyone could afford the products that we were making. So we had to, you know, engage in philanthropy and giving and other ways to make sure that everyone ultimately had access. And then, as you may know, in the first stock offering, he put aside a chunk of stock, which became then the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, which I've been serving on for 10 years on the board. And the foundation now has become one of the biggest foundations devoted to philanthropy in the world. We are giving away something like $500 million a year in grants, all devoted to trying to create a culture of health in this country. And again, it's the communications part of it that is just so terribly important. And a lot of this was all inspired by that credo, that value set. And when I became active in professional circles, and we saw in the 90s, you know, a lot of organizations having difficulty, it was because they hadn't articulated their values. They hadn't decided what was really important and what they were going to protect in times of crisis. And we began through the Arthur Page Society and elsewhere to expand that knowledge, to share the experiences. And many, many organizations now have come along, and as you well know, it's graduated from a statement of values to the sense of purpose, not just selling product, but the purpose for their organization. And it really is public relations people who have been the drivers and the center of this, and to articulate it. And you know, if that's not making a difference in one's career, I don't know what is. Larry Foster, when he retired and I moved in, he and his wife had graduated from Penn State, and he was a big supporter of the university. And he got the idea to create a research center at Penn State at the College of Communications, which would be devoted to his vision, being that everyone in communications with the public shared a very important responsibility to the truth and the highest ethical standards. And he broadened the concept to not just be public relations people, but to include journalists, media companies, industry executives, public service people. And so with contributions, substantial contributions that he and his wife put up, plus some of their friends, the Page Center for Integrity and Public Communication was endowed by him, and has been very, very successful over the years that it's been in place. He also, Larry, knew that although the center had to operate on its own, there needed to be a way to share the results of the research. And so he recommended that they form an advisory board. And I've had the privilege of chairing that advisory board for now the last 5 or 6 years. And it has most of the prior Page Society chairmen. We have journalists and public service people. It's a terrific group of people. And 6 years ago, in the midst of the presidential campaign, when everything was coming apart and fake news was, you know, the topic of the day, and what we were going to do about that, our board met, and we said, you know, what can we do about this? And we decided at the time that the best thing we could do would be to identify and recognize people in all the disciplines of communication who had exhibited integrity in public communications in their work throughout their lives. So we created an event held in New York, and we have recognized a number of very, very important people. And this year's event is on February 24th. Has to be virtual, and our lead honoree is going to be Dr. Anthony Fauci. We're also recognizing Judy Woodruff of the NPR Nightly News, Eugene Robinson, who's associate editor and reporter for the Washington Post, and Bill Heyman, who has owned and run a search firm in New York for many, many years. And Bill has grown much further beyond just the work of search. He understands the value and importance of this function, and he also understands the importance of developing leaders for the future. So it's going to be a good event, and it has become one of those, central features in the development of our profession. Included in that, of course, are the 2 meetings by the Arthur Page Society, the meetings organized by the Institute for PR, and more what the Museum for Public Relations is doing in bringing people together to talk about the issues, to build consensus, and to unite ourselves around this very important quest for rebuilding public trust. The Page Society, when I was first introduced to it, as I mentioned, the principles espoused by the organization fit so well with the responsibilities that were articulated in the Johnson & Johnson credo, that organization really meant a great deal to me. It was fairly small at the time, and at the time I joined, it was only recently that the founders, Ed Block and Jack Coaten and Larry Foster and a few others, were kind of moving on. And so it was up to a new generation of us to bring it along. And since that time, we have had so many great leaders. With the society, membership is now 4 or 5 times what it was before. It's expanded globally. And during the time of the pandemic, the networking opportunities have become so very, very important that society plays a very important role in our overall profession. And their mission today, of course, is to unite great communicators from all over the world against a common set of values and practices. And that is a very good thing for our profession. In a lot of years in this business, you run into a lot of people, and I probably should mention some. I hate to start naming names because I'm afraid I'll leave someone out, but people who've been very influential in my life certainly start with Harold Burson. I've known for a very long time. Jim Burke, the CEO of Johnson & Johnson, and his successor, Ralph Larson, who I worked for. And then on the practice side, Jack Coaten and Ed Block, who were with AT&T. Marilyn Laurie, certainly a wonderful story. Dick Martin has a new book published by the museum that you really ought to get a look at. It's the best story that I have ever seen of how this function works internally at an organization. It's just a wonderful book. But those are, I forgot to mention Howard Pastor, who we lost several years ago. But Howard and I were very, very close. He, was with the Clinton administration, and when he left there, he became the head of Hill and Knowlton in Washington, and then moved to New York. We became very good friends, and we came from different backgrounds. He came from organized labor and understood that point of view, and I was from the management side of this business. But I have about 20 other names here on a list that I have to mention, people who have had such an influence on me. Roger Bolton, who's the current president, CEO of Page Society, is just an enormous person, has done so much for this profession. John Onoda, John Awada, Tom Martin, Don Wright, Dave Sansom, Gary Sheffer, Charlotte Otto. She and I were competitors when she was at Procter & Gamble, but we worked together on many, many things. Merrill McDonald, Marjorie Krause, and two media people, both with fortune, Jeff Colvin and Alan Murray, who is the current CEO. These are people who hold the highest values, who really understand the importance of the function and the work that we do. And through the Page Center and Museum, we're beginning to build better relations between media companies, reporters, and public relations people. We really, we share this very, very important responsibility of communicating with the public. And we understand that we can't take it lightly. We can't allow it to be corrupted. And particularly in this time, with all of the difficulties that we face, the divisiveness we face, and yet all of the extraordinary opportunities that technology has put before us, this communications function and communicating with the public has never been more important than it is right now. So to all young people who are considering a career in this field, I think you're onto the right idea. You need to learn about it to make sure that it's the right, place for you. The way I describe this, if you're okay with 3 or 4 things going on at once, that's what this is. You got a lot of balls in the air. The other thing is that it's rare that you accomplish, some big thing during your day in the office. A lot of things are always moving forward, and if you're okay with that, you can take that, then that's fine. And as I've said many times, the therapy that I adopted for not being able to get things done is I wash the dishes every night after dinner. That was the one thing that I knew I could complete. I could clean up the kitchen, put everything away, and be done with it. And at the office, there were 6 or 8 things that were going on. Again, I will say I feel blessed to have had a wonderful career. I truly believe this function is a calling. The opportunity going forward is so great, to make a difference, to change the world, to deal with the horrific problems that we have, divisiveness, racism, inequality. We need to improve diversity. We need to bring more women along. All of these things are addressed first and foremost by the skills in communications and public relations.